When you boot up Master Duel for the first time, you're at the mercy of the game to build whatever deck you want. Some base their decks on already competitive decks, some base it on what's one of the first ultra rares they get, and others base it on the card art.
I'm going to have some milk!
But the most common tactic for people starting the game for the first time is building a deck based on the anime. From Dark Magicians all the way up to Code Talkers recently, building an anime-based deck is a tried and true method, but not necessarily good. Remember, the anime has to simplify playstyles to fit in the time frame of the episode, and the rules for certain cards are often changed come their actual publication. But that being said, there are still plenty of anime-based decks that are actually pretty good, and I'm going to go over a good chunk of them for each individual era. Also, for the sake of convenience, I'm going for a meta-neutral listing for this. As of writing, tier limits are the biggest threat in Master Duel, but they may not be that way forever. So I'm opting for a more generalized list rather than something that counters the meta. Also, we're going with the Master Duel ban list because Master Duel being so open to deck creation makes it prime breeding ground for trying out odd decks. Let's start this off with the Duel Monsters era, the one that started it all, the OG, the icon, the one that's had the worst aged cards. When Duel Monsters came out, Yu-Gi-Oh didn't really have a lot of proper archetypes and deck theming. It was more so geared towards a bunch of monsters strung together. So whenever new cards come out for what little there is, they have to work around the cards from back then, which can be tricky. Like, how do you take a normal monster like Gaia the Fierce Knight that was rough even for the time, and make an archetype for him? And even the two biggest ones, Dark Magician and Blue Eyes, are heavily flawed. Dark Magicians are pretty consistent, but don't have a strong endgame outside of Dark Magic Circle Disruption, which isn't exactly hard to counter or even that impressive. Blue Eyes, on the other hand, have a better end goal with big anime punch monsters, but in contrast are very inconsistent, being lovingly referred to as Brick Eyes. And do not get me started on the God cards. But that doesn't mean I wasn't able to find any anime decks that were good from this era. For example, Buster Blader. Buster Blader is a trap-based deck themed around control, with the ideal end board not only turning your opponent's monsters into dragons, but preventing them from special summoning from the extra deck and using their effects. They can be pretty brutal on their own, and pairing them up with other dragon archetypes like good old Brandon can really add to their power. I think what works for Buster Blader is the fact that Buster Blader isn't the crutch of the deck compared to something like Dark Magician or Blue Eyes. Blader getting some retrains helps a lot. And speaking of retrains, how about Umi Control? Yes, Mako Tsunami's funny fish monsters all got pretty powerful retrains and are now themed more around control. From keeping your opponent to only a select number of non-water monsters, negating, and general disruption. Umi Control is a pretty powerful deck, if not the most consistent, trust me on this. I think Umi Control has aged well primarily thanks to the sheer amount of support for Umi or Umi adjacent cards over the years, meaning that this deck isn't going away anytime soon, thankfully. Also, I'd be insane not to mention Cubics, which is a very versatile deck that uses control tactics without relying too much on floodgates, being able to build up strong monsters and burn, but that's from the movie, which was from 2015, and it kind of felt like cheating. Still a dang cool deck though. Now we entered the GX era. In many respects, GX is where we first started to see archetypes come into their own, with decks getting more dedicated gimmicks, playstyles, and theming. But that doesn't mean they were necessarily good a lot of the time. I mean, if you know someone who got big wins with Arcana Force, Viacroids, or Venoms, they're lying to you, as well as themselves. Compare this to some of the non-anime decks that were in the GX era, it's kind of surprising how mid a lot of the anime decks were. But, on the other hand, heroes are one of the best aged archetypes in the game. It feels like no matter what format, heroes will pop up. Thanks to the mix of being able to go second or first, crazy consistency, some really heavy hitting boss monsters, and floodgates, and being so popular that Konami will release new support for it for years to come. Sure, they are quite vulnerable to spells and you have to give your kidney to play them, but heroes aren't a bad option for someone getting into the game. Plus they just look so cool! And that's kinda it. Yeah, not as many heavy hitters at the moment for GX, sad to say. It's a bit too early to say if the new support for Volcanics will elevate them. Cyber Dragons, while you can get some wins with them, just rely too much on going second to the point the monster made to help them with going first is better in other decks. Sacred Beasts make big monsters but are otherwise comically weak. And Crystal Beasts? No. Just no. But Conclave Control at my original. Shh. You need to let go. Jesse Anderson isn't real, and neither are your yaoi doujinshis. I promise you, it'll be alright. We're taking you somewhere where you'll get the help you need. Well, now after that bit of disappointment, we move on to 5Ds. Now we're in the era where modern Yu-Gi-Oh begins. It all starts here. Crazy combos, the extra deck, hand traps, big archetypes. It's all here. So naturally you'd expect some great decks to be here, right? Okay, to be fair, there are some really good decks that were in the anime at this time. It's just as time went on, they got severely power crept. Such is the case for decks like Infernity, which, while one of the most powerful decks at the time, are nowadays not so usable. I still love them though. Plus, the anime was still in the mindset of put a bunch of random cards together for deck building, as was the case of Akiza, with her deck stacked with plants that you wouldn't even dream of using now. And some decks that are still good, like Naturia, are so barely featured in the anime they don't even count. The monster they used is Leo Drake, literally the worst one. But luckily the two decks that are still good are still incredibly good. First up is obviously Synchrons. Yeah, Junk Speeder is one of the most vulnerable monsters in the game, with it being exceptionally submissive and negatable. But still, the fact is you can build some unbelievably strong fields with this guy. Just make sure you have a stable internet connection. And of course, where would we be without Blackwing? Second only to Heroes, Blackwings are one of the most supported archetypes in the game. It makes sense, their gimmick of swarming the field is something that really hasn't aged at all as the game has gone on. They can negate, they can burn, they can disrupt, they can steal. They got it all. Plus, it's just nice to have cards from 2009 that are still good years later. Take that, TCG market markup. Moving on to Zexal, I always got the feeling Zexal the anime was a quasi-reboot aimed at a younger audience. The early episodes of the series are mostly geared towards teaching some of the game's simpler mechanics.
Flip effect activate! What's a flip effect?
Yuma, if you've played the game so much, how have you never seen a flip monster? Oh, right. So a lot of the decks are back to mostly being themed around mishmashes, and a lot of the archetypes aren't particularly great. Though there are some big exceptions, and I think these next two are rather underrated in that regard. First up, there's Utopia, which granted isn't the most powerful deck in the world and does rely mostly on big anime punching, but has some surprising usage. Thanks to them being surprisingly freeform to what you can bring out, you can do some pretty nice combinations, such as negators and disruptions, as well as doing what Utopia does best, big punch! And remember how I said that Cyber Dragon Infinity is better in other decks? Galaxy Eyes is that deck. Galaxy Eyes for a deck dedicated to just making the big monster, do it in a pretty efficient way, unlike a lot of other beater decks. And they can actually go first relatively okay. Through the right build, they can tear through your opponent surprisingly well. Shame that the structure deck for Master Duel is a Cypher deck. There are a couple of other decks I could have included, like Numerons, though they suffer from being just so repetitive that I wouldn't recommend them to new players. And Water Xyz, which I would have recommended easily if not for, you know. So, coming up with suggestions for Arc 5 was a bit difficult. Not that Arc 5 had bad decks. Oh, quite the opposite. Arc 5 has so many good decks, I can't keep it short. I think given that they wanted to support every summoning mechanic they had up to that point, I think Konami decided to go all out when designing these. It's genuinely impressive how many of these decks are still usable, either pure or utilized with something else. Lyralesk is still incredibly fun and works well with Tri-Brigade. Super Heavy Samurai is bigger than ever in OCG right now. Predaplants works so well with Brandon, and even though I hate Phantom Knights, I can't deny that they're a good deck. Okay, maybe I can a little. Your deck is just DPE Turbo with some traps! And of course, there's Pendulum Magicians, Yugioh Star Monsters, which still get support to this day and for good reason. Impressive, given Konami's weird regret for pendulums. There's honestly not a lot I can say, there's just a lot to love here. Just one big happy family of decks, just like the Arc 5 manga ending. Don't look it up. Given that it's the most recent series and Vrains receives particular praise for having some of the most realistic and intense duels in the entire franchise, surely this is swarming with just as many great decks as Arc 5, right? Not really? If I had to pinpoint a reason why, it's probably Master Rule 4 rearing its ugly head again. Master Rule 4, for those who don't remember, was a specific ruling where extra deck monsters could only go in the extra monster zones, unless there was a link monster where you could summon to the zone said link monsters point to. It was one of the worst mistakes in the history of the game. It crippled a majority of the decks out there and wasn't fixed until 3 years later. So as a result, compared to Arc 5, the remaining decks were limited in comparison, and once Master Rule 4 was lifted, some of the decks that were powerful when it was around just don't hit as much. Goki was almost tier 0 for a bit, but have been pretty much left in the dust, and Trickstars, one of the craziest, most feared decks released at the time, now rarely pops up. But thankfully there are still some decks that have aged well, starting with Rockets, also known as Dragon Links. While I'm not a fan of the reliance on grass for some builds, they still have some amazing boss monsters and support that make for a very powerful combo deck. And speaking of boss monsters, at Ignister have debatably the best boss monster ever released with the Arrival, who still needs a summon animation and can be paired up with Math Mechs to build further powerful end boards. And while Trickstars have been left behind, Blue Angel's other deck, Marincess, have been given some great support over the years, including a spell-negating monster that, when played right, becomes unaffected by your opponent's card effects. Salamangreats and Code Talkers, who, yes, have been overshadowed by Math Mech as of late, are still very fun to play with and provide an easy pathway to the classic Update Jammer access code OTK. And finally, Altergeist, while not as combo focused as a lot of these, still make for a brutal control deck that can be quite the pain to your opponent. I would have also liked to have put Sun Avalons on here, but the best way to use them is with Rikas. I'm torn between whether that's more a Rika or Sun Avalon. And Armatos Legio is a really cool deck with an awesome ancient Roman statue theme. They seem like they'd be great fun. Oh wait, they're a fake deck. Thanks, Studio Gallop. No wonder they told you couldn't do the show anymore, you tease. Woo! And there we go, that's the list. Overall, while some of the early anime decks have it a bit rough, a lot of the later decks still have some bite, particularly those released in the Arc 5 era. Now, sorry if I couldn't go super in depth with all of these, I just wanted to do a glance over. But still, definitely try these out and let me know what you think. And if you've used any of these decks before, please tell me about your experience using them in the comments, please subscribe, and can we please get some more Trickstar support? I don't want their best strategy to still be burn and then chat with my opponent until the timer runs out. I need some more strats, dang it!